All right, today is November 27th, the first Monday after Thanksgiving, November 27th, and it's 11 o'clock a.m. Eastern time. So this is going to be the time we meet for the study of classical reasoning. We're going to go through all of classical reasoning over time, but we're going to work through it little by little to make sure we understand everything, talk about all the details. And my goal in this live class, my goal is to help students make progress through the classical reasoning courses as easily as possible. So it's assumed, while anyone's free to join us or watch these recorded videos, they're intended for students who are enrolled in classical reasoning courses, and they're intended to help you complete the assignments and make progress as well as possible. So that's the purpose of these meetings. Students are free to come with any questions they have. The way that our live classes will work is that I'll normally open up the meeting room 10 or 15 minutes before our scheduled meeting time. So if there's anything you want to talk about beforehand, you have any questions or anything like that, you can plan on having access to me before we get started. Then around 11 o'clock, 11:05, I'll start the recording and we'll get into our real lesson. And then at the end of the hour, I'll stop the recording and I'll hang out in the chat and take any questions or discussion topics that you'd like to get into after the class is over. So there's plenty of time for questions. There's plenty of time for discussion. But I'm going to use the hour to get through as much content as I can to make these classes as helpful for you as possible. And I may feel at times for you that I'm moving quickly or rushing through things, but remember, you can rewatch these videos. So I don't need to back up and repeat and review and all that stuff like I would in a live classroom, because you can replay the video. So it's a little bit different than classroom teaching. In a classroom, the teacher can't back up. The teacher can't, the kids can't replay the class. So teachers have to be very careful. But in recorded classes, I can be a little less careful to review and repeat things all the time because you can take care of that yourself. Okay, so today, what I'd like to do in this first class is I'd like to just give all of you an introduction to classical reasoning that I think will be very helpful. It'll help you to understand what we're studying. It'll help you to understand why we're studying it, and I think help you to appreciate it. All right, sometimes when you're a kid studying, you get into some subjects and you just sit around wondering, why in the world do I need to study this? When am I ever going to use this? And so on. I remember being like that with algebra when I was in 7th and 8th grade, just had no clue what the teacher was even talking about. She never explained, what the subject was or why we needed to study it or how we could use it. We just were, rushed into the textbook and we started doing exercises and activities, and I just mentally checked out in 7th grade and wanted nothing to do with mathematics after that. So I know how that can be for students, especially when some of these subjects are what's called abstract. They don't necessarily have a practical use immediately in your life. So it's difficult to study when you really don't know what the goal of this study is. So I'd like to take some time today and explain classical reasoning, why we study it, why it's important, how we can use it in our lives, and so on. So I'll try to address that issue and make it one of your favorite classes. Now, as we get started, you'll notice that this is going to be a small class. It'll always have less students in it than some of the other live classes. Aesop's fables, maybe a composition class where there's debate. You'll see lots of students present for some live classes, and then you'll see other live classes where there aren't many students, and there's a reason for that. Reasoning is a different kind of study. Reasoning is a study that separates the great students from the average or ordinary students. It separates them because it's difficult. It's really difficult. It takes a lot of exercise. it's like playing sports, you know. Everyone loves to just run around and play games, but when you get into serious sports where there's technique to learn and training necessary, and it's very demanding physically, the crowd gets smaller and smaller as the sport gets more and more competitive. And it's the same way with studies. When we get into studies that are more difficult, more challenging, more exact, you know, you can't share your opinion. You can't just say what you think. You can't be inaccurate. You can't be sloppy and get away with it. Those studies become less and less popular. And reasoning is always going to be by far the most difficult study that there is. It's the most difficult study by a mile. So we're never going to have a big crowd of people. You're never going to be popular or in a big group when you're studying reasoning. In fact, if you really want to master this subject, which is the most important subject of all subjects, you're going to have to often study it by yourself. It's sort of a lonely study. And that's why throughout history, philosophers were, you know, always told that they had to embrace what's called solitude, or, you know, loneliness for the sake of some pursuits. And what should motivate you in these pursuits, you know, they're lonely pursuits because you often have to work at them by yourself. But if you think of working at them for the sake of others, and then share what you learn with others, or use what you learn for the benefit of others, well, then they become very, very useful, and they can become part of your social life, of your personal life, of your family life, and so on. So the use of them is beneficial to many and will be popular, but the study of them is very difficult and therefore will never be popular. And the motivation of our study is to learn things for the sake of others, so that we can share with others what we've learned, or the fruits of our learning. The motto of Saint Dominic, who was a great saint in the 1200s, the founder of the Dominican order, his motto was to contemplate, which means to study and meditate, and to share the fruits of that contemplation. So that's, if you wonder how is lonely studying, you know, an act of love or charity towards others, it's because we are willing to do the work that's very difficult, that very few people are willing to do, so that we can share it with others and use it to help others, use it to defend others, use it to teach others, use it to provide advice for others, and so on. So the study of it requires an act of love on your part, to be willing to go through this work for the sake of others. And then there are, you know, many benefits for you personally. It will make you better in all of your studies. It will make you very good at thinking critically and reasoning through things. If you wanted to get into scientific research, it will make you a better researcher. If you want to get into politics, it will make you a good debater. It'll help you to understand law. It will help you to think through, you know, problem solving. Let's say if you wanted to be a doctor, you know, going through problems or symptoms that patients have, and trying to figure out what the causes can be, and then prescribe remedies for those things. All of that requires very, very careful reasoning. And most students in modern schools never study reasoning. And it's one of the reasons why there's really so much craziness, so much kookiness that we see in the news and just in life in general. People don't study these things, and you'll see why. It's difficult. That's why they don't study them. So what I'd like to do is share a quote with you real quick. I'm going to share my screen here. I'm going to share a quote with you. This is a book that was written by Saint John Henry Newman. He was a saint who lived in England in the late 1800s and early 1900s. He wrote a book titled On the Idea of a University. It was a book about education. And in this book, he talks about problems in modern education in his day, right, which is, again, around 1920, let's say around 1920. So about 100 years ago. He wrote about problems in education in his day and how they could be solved. And I want to share a quote from that book here, which starts right up here. You see where it says nothing. Now, in modern society, And I'm sure that as students, you've heard these kinds of things. You'll hear people talk about how important it is to read. You'll hear about how important it is to develop a love of reading, and how having books and reading books is so good for you. Well, I would disagree with that. I'm going to argue against that. And the reason I'm going to argue against that is because before the television was invented, before social media was available, before the internet was developed and things like that, all that people had were books. And so if you were a silly, idle person that didn't like to work, didn't really like to study, just wanted to like watch TV shows or scroll through social media posts, you didn't have televisions or YouTube or social media. What you had were books. And there were good books, there were serious books that needed to be studied, and then there were silly books, just foolish books, sinful books, idle books, and so on. So to sit around reading books before the television was invented was just like sitting around watching television or sitting around scrolling through social media. There was nothing good about reading books, but we get this idea, some people get this idea that reading books is good and watching television is bad, or watching YouTube videos is bad. But, you should, if you're reading, that's good. And so you'll have kids who go to the library and they can get any book they want in the library. It could be silly, goofy, nonsense, idleness. And as long as they're reading, it's considered good. But the same kids won't be allowed to like watch any TV show or watch any YouTube video and so on. And so we get this dopey idea that just because it's reading, just because we're reading books, it's good. And that's not true. Now, if we go back before television time, back into the early 1900s, we find people like John Henry Newman sitting there in this period where people are wasting time with books, where reading books is the way that they waste time. And so he wrote this, and I want to read this as we get started in classical reasoning. He wrote, "Nothing is more common in an age like this. Nothing is more common in an age like this when books abound." So there's tons of books all over the place. And remember, he wrote this in around 1920. Okay, nothing is more common in an age like this when books abound than to fancy or imagine, than to think that the gratification of a love of reading is real study. Nothing is more common in an age like this when there's books available all over the place than to think that the gratification of a love of reading is real study. In other words, when there's tons of books, it's very common for people to imagine that reading and satisfying a desire to read, a love of reading, is somehow real study or real academic work. Just because it's reading does not mean that it's study. Just because it's reading does not mean that it's academic work, because real academic work has certain goals. Real academic work leads a student from ignorance to a knowledge of what are called sciences, scientific knowledge in any subject. So study is something very specific. It's where you work to acquire the knowledge of an art or a science. That's study. Study is difficult. Study is work. Reading can just be a pleasure activity, just like watching television, just like, watching YouTube videos or scrolling through social media. Now, the problem in our generation, 100 years later, is that we've got the television, all these things where even reading for many kids is considered difficult. For adults, hardly anyone even reads at all because they just watch videos, watch TV shows, watch movies, scroll through social media, talk nonsense with friends and so on. So today in 2023, we can hardly even get anyone to read at all. So we've got even bigger problems. It's even harder today to get people to study than it was in John Henry Newman's day. At least then they were reading. It was maybe one step better, even though it was still not study. So today, the situation that you face as kids, I'll be honest with you, your situation is even worse, even more difficult. And that's why, I have mercy on students, mercy on kids, because you face temptations and difficulties and challenges that I didn't even have to face when I was your age. And certainly kids who were living in the time of St. John Henry Newman, they didn't need to face the kinds of stuff that's available today. And there's just so much, and it's so gratifying to a desire for entertainment, or a desire just to learn new stuff or to gossip or whatever. It's very difficult to get away from it. It's very difficult to pick up a book or to read and study from text because of how lazy we've become, because the media has become so easy for us to use. And the truth is, the media is not producing the stuff that we need to study. It's producing stuff that's meant to entertain us, which is reasonable, okay? It's business for them. They're seeking to entertain and get lots of viewers. They're not seeking to teach arts and sciences. But John Henry Newman said, nothing is more common in an age like this, when books abound, than to fancy that the gratification of a love of reading is real study. And what he says is that kids like to read, and you can apply this to videos and all other kinds of stuff. Kids like to read who have a taste for reading, but what motivates their desire to read is little more than the result of mental restlessness and curiosity. Such minds cannot fix their gaze on one subject for 2 seconds together. The very impulse that leads them to read at all leads them to read on, and never to stay or hang over any one idea. The pleasurable excitement of reading what is new is their motive principle, and the imagination that they are doing something and the boyish vanity which accompanies it are their reward. Okay? So the point John Henry Newman is making is that there are arts and sciences that need to be studied. And there's no easy way to study them. There's no easy way to do it. You're going to have to apply yourself mentally. You're going to have to read. You're going to have to reread. You're going to have to meditate. You're going to have to memorize things. You're going to have to take notes. You're going to have to complete assignments. It takes a lot of focused work. You've got to be mature. You've got to be self-disciplined in order to attain knowledge of these arts and sciences, to become a wise or educated person. It's difficult. The temptation to just read, and you know what it feels like. I'm sure you know what it feels like, where your mind is just flooded with constantly changing thoughts and ideas and songs and words from songs and images and videos and pictures. Your mind is all over the place. And getting control of your mind and really zeroing it in and focusing it on specific subjects for a long period of time, so you can really make progress in those studies, is very, very difficult. And yet that's what has to be done. That's what has to be done. Now, in sports, we often understand this. You know, if any of you play sports, we know you've got to learn technique. You've got to practice and practice and practice. You've got to play games. Then you go back to practice. Then over the off season, you exercise. You try to make yourself faster or stronger. You practice all the techniques. Then the season starts again. You have practice and practice and practice and games and more practice. And everyone understands that if you want to get good at something like a sport, you've got to focus on it and devote your attention to developing those skills and all of the different strengths and abilities that are needed for that one sport. If you just play 100 different games, you really don't get good at any of them. You just sort of dabble with all of them. But to get really good at something, you have to focus on that one thing. And so when we come to reasoning, the question is, who is able and willing to concentrate and focus to learn an art like the art of reasoning? That's going to be the challenge. It's not a question of whether kids want to do it. It's going to be a question of both, whether students want to do it and whether they can do it, because it's very, very difficult. So that's the challenge. And I wanted to share that with you from St. John Henry Newman, because I want you to think about the generation you live in and how difficult it is, and how virtuous a decision it is that you're going to have to make to focus yourself and study and work if you want to make progress in these real studies. And as I said before, these studies separate you from other students. They separate you from the regular crowd of kids who are all doing the same things. You know, some of you ask, what about documentaries? Yep, they're all watching documentaries. They're all on IXL. They're all on Khan Academy. They're all doing these sorts of things. But, you know, it's a lot of movement side to side, but there's no real movement upwards. There's no real progress, just a lot of activity. And so you've got to be careful that, again, just like, you know, leisure books and silly books and magazines and newspapers and, you know, all that kind of stuff that's just easy, lazy reading. There are school activities, like busy work school activities, that do the same thing. They don't help you to grow and advance. They just keep you busy in these elementary level studies that are required for, you know, basic things like a high school diploma, which everyone gets. That's really not going to help you in life. Everyone's going to have a high school diploma. So to really make progress and distinguish yourself, you've got to take upon yourself greater challenges and be willing to do work that other people aren't willing to do. And that's what, you know, the best colleges and employers and, you know, even customers for future business owners and workers, they're looking for the people who take these challenges on and who seek to do more. That's what they're looking for. They're looking to find those students who are willing to take on the challenges and try to make more of themselves than just be ordinary kids growing up in a society filled with all kinds of media to keep everybody busy. So this is the challenge. Now, my desire is to help you to succeed in this challenge. My desire is to help you with these studies. So these live classes, they're not intended to be videos that you just sit and watch. They're not going to replace the need to study the lessons. They're not going to get you any grades for the courses. You're going to have to do the work yourself. But these classes are intended to help you. Remember what I said before. The purpose of study, the goal of study, the way you should think about study is you take upon yourself the challenge of studying so that you can share your learning with others and try to make their real study a little bit easier for them. You can't make it easy, that's impossible, but you can make it a little bit easier. You can make it more efficient. And that's what should motivate your study. So for me, this is me actually doing that. This is how I do that. I pursue these things in my own study. I study to understand these things. And this is my opportunity to try to help some willing students to learn them more easily or more efficiently than I was able to learn them. Okay. So that's what I'd like to do in these classes. But I really want to stress these live classes are not going to replace, they're not going to replace the need to study the lessons, complete the assignments, and so on. They're just going to help you to do that. Okay. We're going to talk about, you know, general issues in a lot of these classes because it's important for students to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it, why it's important, why these things matter, and so on. So I'm going to spend time in these meetings explaining the studies in ways that help you to appreciate them, because that motivates your study and makes it meaningful for you, and that helps you to have the strength to pursue the knowledge of these things. So that's my job as a teacher, is to help you to understand the studies and motivate you to study them. And then when you run into trouble, you know, I didn't have this privilege when I was your age. So when I got a little older, I took up these studies. And when I ran into trouble, there was no one that I could turn to. I didn't have anybody to ask for help. I had to dig through other books and commentaries. Some of them aren't even in English. I had to read them in Latin and things like that just to get help to make progress in these studies. I want to save you from a lot of that and help you to make progress more easily than I did. So that's the goal of these classes, all right? So the first part of today's class is just understanding why this is going to be a small class, why these studies will always feel kind of lonely, and what the motivation is to study them, right? The motivation is to be willing to learn these things and gain these arts and sciences so that you can be the person who helps others with them, who shares them with others. Now, that help could be, simple charity type work, helping people, like teaching the ignorant is a work of mercy. Well, you can't do that work of mercy if you don't study, because you'll be ignorant yourself. So studying allows you to do the works of mercy. That's one thing, but it also applies to business and your professional life in the future, earning a living, establishing a career, and so on. The more arts and sciences, the more real skills you can develop, the more opportunities you'll have to do things in business or whatever it is that you want to pursue. So there's use of these arts and sciences, but most of all, I mean, give me a break. We're talking about the art of reasoning. There's no more useful art than the art of reasoning. And I'll try to help you appreciate it as we go along, because some of the topics, if you've already started studying Aristotle's works online, some of these topics are difficult to understand. It's difficult to understand what in the world we're going to do with these things, right? So I'll help you to understand that kind of practical stuff and appreciate the lessons. All right. So that's an introduction I wanted to get into, just to encourage you in these studies, to help you to understand that when you find them difficult, it's not because something's wrong with you, it's because these studies are really difficult. When you hear people, talking today about learning disorders and attention deficit disorder, that's not a disease, that's a condition, and there's causes of that condition. One of the causes is that there's just so much distraction. That's why it's attention deficit, difficulty keeping attention, difficulty focusing, difficulty studying. It's not that there's a disease in the person, it's that there's so much distracting them. And so it's very difficult to do these studies. And you'll hear this kind of language all the time, because it's going to be more and more difficult over time to do these studies. And if you're going to do them, you've got to take what are called practical measures. You've got to take real practical steps to help yourself concentrate and focus, keep your mind simple, and make progress over a long period of time in these studies. So that's the challenge. And if you feel that that's difficult, that's the challenge, right? There's not something wrong with you. Very few people pursue these studies because there's so much to distract us. It's very hard to develop this kind of mind. And if you can do that, then you separate yourself as one of the only people who can do it. And that's where, many of the advantages in this life come from, just separating yourself as an expert in a subject that other people don't know. So that's some simple motivation. All right. Any questions about any of that stuff before I get on to the next part that I'd like to talk about here today? Any questions about any of that? Again, I saw some of you mention documentaries before. Yeah, I would recommend documentaries, but documentaries are just part of history studies. Okay, documentary, that's just humanities. That's not real core arts and sciences. So think about that. Any questions before we move on? You can say no if you don't have a question, just so I know that you're not typing something. No questions? All right, so let's move on. Let's talk about this study. So here you are, and you can see on your screen here, I've got the Academy Study Center opened up, and you can see all the course subject areas, trivium, quadrivium, blah, 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 blah. When you look at this curriculum, and it's rare for a student to be able to look at the curriculum that they're actually studying. Most schools don't even tell the kids what the curriculum is, because they can't in many places. But here we have a very simple curriculum. It's been around for thousands and thousands of years, and we work through it in our studies in the Academy. You'll see that the first 4 subject areas, trivium, quadrivium, philosophy, and theology, they're the main core subjects. So what it means to gain knowledge in real studies, to gain knowledge in these arts and sciences, is to study these 4 subject areas. These are where the real studies are found. And you'll know that what I'm saying is true, because if you think about humanities studies like history and literature or modern studies, most modern students like humanities and modern studies, and St. John Henry Newman talks about that because they're relatively easy, right? Except for something like algebra, because algebra is more of an art and a science. Most students don't like algebra. But in these four subject areas, trivium, quadrivium, philosophy, and theology, that's where the core courses really are. And if we open up the trivium, we find that there are 3 subjects in the trivium. Anybody know what the 3 subjects in the trivium are? What are the 3 subjects in the trivium? What are the 3 subjects in the trivium? Anybody know what they are? Grammar is one, very good. That's the first one. Reasoning is the second. And rhetoric is the third, very good. Spelled R-H-E-T, R-H-E-T. So the three subjects of the trivium, are grammar, reasoning, and rhetoric. Grammar is the art of language itself. And any of you who have had to learn other languages know that this is one of those subjects that is very difficult to learn. It's very difficult to learn another language because it's a science, and you've got to study it very diligently, and it's just very difficult. It's very difficult to learn another language. Grammar is the first of the 3 arts of the trivium. Okay, yeah, very useful. Again, it's very useful because it separates you from everybody else. You know, everybody speaks English. So if you can add Spanish to your English, well, now you're more useful. Now you've made yourself more useful. And if you can add Chinese to your Spanish and English, well, now you're even more useful. And if you can add Latin and Greek and German and French, you just see how that work, and it's very, very difficult work, that work brings you the rewards of being able to read more, understand more, communicate with a larger body of people, and so on. That's the result of that kind of work. Yeah, some languages are harder than others. English is one of the most difficult. All right, so the first of the 3 arts of the trivium, which are like language arts, the first one is language itself, which is the study of grammar. And so when you look at the courses in the academy, you start at the top here and just scroll down, you'll see that these all have to do with language and grammar, all the way down until the 300 level. And then you see things start to change. And at the 300 level, we move from grammar into reasoning. And reasoning is the next study, the next subject in the trivium. Reasoning, we assume you already know the language. So you've got to study grammar first before you can study reasoning. But in reasoning, we seek to understand the arguments and how arguments work. So it's moving beyond just learning sentences and how to make sentences in a language, how to speak in a meaningful way. In reasoning, we seek to learn how the mind actually works, how people become convinced of things, how things are made credible, and so on. And we study that art, that science in reasoning. And if you look, you'll see that there are 2 courses here, logic and rhetoric, classical logic and classical rhetoric. Those are simpler classes that are just intended for high school studies, okay? So if you need a logic class for your senior year of high school, or if you need a rhetoric class for your junior year of high school, those 2 courses are intended to be like a 1-year study that you can just go through and get finished and add it to your transcript, okay? But if you really want to study the art of reasoning, you'll see these 5 courses. 5 courses, and they're numbered 371 through 375. These are the real courses in which we study classical reasoning. Okay, so in these live classes, what we're going to be looking at is the content of these 5 courses. All right, classical reasoning 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So the question is, well, where does the content of these classes come from? Like, what are we studying exactly? And I've outlined this on a Google Doc here that I'm going to share. These courses that we study in classical reasoning are a series of works that were written in the ancient world in which the art and science of reasoning was was not only taught, but was actually discovered and established. Because Aristotle, who's the author, I'll talk about him in a minute, Aristotle didn't just write some books. He is the one in history who actually figured out the science of reasoning. So he's both the discoverer or the establisher of this art, and he's also the teacher of it. So he's very rare in that we have access to the writings of the person who actually discovered the science of reasoning in history. We're very lucky to have that. So we're going to be studying a bunch of works by Aristotle, and they're listed here, and I'll talk about them for a minute. You might want to just jot some of this stuff down. As for Aristotle, I've got the date of his life up here. You should know something about him if you've studied world chronology, right? Aristotle lived from 384 to 322 BC. Now, who cares, right? What do dates mean? Well, when we read someone, anytime we study an author, we should look at the dates of his or her life, and we should ask, what's significant about these dates? What's significant about the time when he lived? The first thing that's significant about the life of Aristotle is that he lived. Yeah, Lara, we'll get there in just a second. The first thing that's important about Aristotle is that we have to realize he lived 300 plus years before Christ came into the world. 384 BC, he was born, so almost 400 years before Christ. Just think, America is hardly 200 years old. Aristotle lived 400 years before Christ. So before Christ came into the world, before the Catholic Church was even established, Aristotle was already writing and teaching and doing these things. Almost 400 years before Christ. That's very important to keep in mind. Now, for those of you who have studied world chronology, just for comparison, when did Moses write the law? When did Moses write the first 5 books of the Bible? Give me a general date from world chronology. Around when did Moses live and write? Just to set some context, hopefully some of you know this. When did Moses live and write? When was the Hebrew Exodus? That's one of the events we study in world chronology. That's good, Gianna. Around 1400 BC, okay? So Moses, again, just keep these dates in mind for context. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Jewish scriptures, wrote the book of Genesis, wrote the law in Exodus and Deuteronomy, wrote the law around 1400 BC, so 1,000 years before Aristotle. The books of Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, those books were already available 1,000 years before Aristotle in Israel. When did Solomon live? Who knows when Solomon lived? Around when did Solomon live? Yeah, that's good. It's good. 950-ish BC, right? That's a good date. Okay, around 900 BC. So again, that's 500 years, right? Before, or almost 600 years before Aristotle. So we've got these ancient wise men, Moses, and even before Moses, Abraham, but we've got Moses in around 1400 BC in Israel. We've got Solomon around 1000 BC or 900 BC in Israel. And the Bible tells us that the wisdom of Solomon spread through the whole world. We don't know exactly what that means, but it's obvious that the things that he wrote, the Proverbs and things like that, made their way around. That Jewish wisdom spread through other countries. And then 500 or 600 years later, we have Aristotle in Greece, okay? North of the Mediterranean Sea, we've got Aristotle working and teaching. Now, as for Aristotle, he himself was taught by a great philosopher. His teacher, does anybody know who his teacher was? Anyone know who taught Aristotle? Aristotle had a famous teacher. Very good, Lara. Plato. Plato was another famous Greek philosopher. He taught Aristotle. Does anyone know who taught Plato? That's okay. Does anyone know who taught Plato? Socrates, very good. So keep those three in mind. Think of the word spa, right? S-P-A. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. So you've got the three great, most famous classical Greek philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But what's interesting, you have Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But Aristotle was the one who discovered the art of reasoning. So that means that Socrates and Plato didn't know it. Okay? So it's important to realize that. Socrates, we know him, he's famous for wisdom. Plato, famous for wisdom. But neither of them knew or taught the art of reasoning because it wasn't figured out yet. They were trying to figure it out. They were figuring out pieces of it. They had parts of it figured out, but the real science of reasoning, they didn't have figured out. Yeah, Socrates was put to death by the government of Athens because he was accused of being an atheist because he didn't believe in the polytheism in all the gods. He was accused of being an atheist, and he was also accused of corrupting the minds of the children by his teaching. So he was put to death, and one of the methods of execution was that you could poison yourself. That was sort of I guess a preferred way to kill yourself. You could choose to have your head cut off or to drink some poison, and most people would probably take the poison route. All right. So anyway, what I want you to see there is, as wise as Socrates was, he did not know the art of reasoning. As wise as Plato was, he did not know the art of reasoning. It was Aristotle who discovered and established and taught the art of reasoning. Plato and Socrates, they figured out what's called dialectical reasoning. It's a kind of reasoning, but it's just one kind, and it's not the most important kind. So if you read Plato's writings and you learn Socrates' dialogues, he has these discussions with people. That's a method of reasoning that's called dialectical reasoning, but it's only a piece of reasoning. They didn't know the most important part of reasoning, which is what Aristotle figured out and teaches us in his classical reasoning. Okay, now the work that Aristotle teaches all of this in is called the Organon. You can see that word on your screen, Organon. That's a Greek word, and what it means is you can either translate it as the method or the instrument. So Aristotle wrote these books in which he taught the art of reasoning, the complete art of reasoning, and the title of that set of books was the Organon. And that word organon means the method or the instrument. It's like the tool that you need to learn to use. It's the method. And it's the method, for what? What is it the method for? It's not just the method of reasoning, it's the method of all sciences. It's the instrument for discovering all sciences, all philosophical sciences. And so the method, the reason why it's so important is if you learn the science and art of reasoning, you then have the tool that's necessary to learn all the other arts and sciences. And remember, the other arts and sciences didn't exist before Aristotle. When we get into these other studies like rhetoric and natural philosophy and moral philosophy, on the soul, on the heavens, all these different subjects, all these different sciences, when you look and you see that Aristotle was the author of all of these sciences, you wonder, how in the world was Aristotle the one that figured all this stuff out? And the answer is, he's the one who figured out the organon. He's the one who figured out the method. And then once he figured it out, he had enough time in his life, thankfully, to put it to work and was able to use it to investigate all these different sciences. And that's where all of his writings on philosophy came from. Okay. So the Organon, which is the library of books that we study to learn the art and science of reasoning, that set of books teaches us the instrument or the method that we can then use to understand the other sciences. Now, we can study the works of Aristotle. And he already investigated and solved many problems that need to be solved. But what's important is that if we study and learn the method ourselves, it helps us in our generation because we have different problems. We have different questions, different issues that Aristotle didn't talk about, issues that Aristotle didn't try to solve because they didn't exist. And I would argue that our society is desperately waiting for Christian students to take up this study, gain these skills, gain this art and science, and then apply it to modern problems to produce modern solutions to modern problems using the method. Okay, so we can't just study Aristotle and answer every question in life because he didn't answer many of the problems that we face today. We need students who understand the method and can apply the method to new questions in the same way that Aristotle applied the method to questions that existed in his day. So that's where the real use comes from for the study of reasoning. All right, so we've got the Organon, this set of books, and I'm sorry, I'm moving through this quickly because I want to get all of this introduced in this first class today. So the Organon consists of 6 books, and there's 7 listed here, but one of them is not part of the Organon. It's 6 books. And if you look, you'll see that the 5 classical reasoning courses that we have in the academy are listed, and the book that's studied in each class is listed under it. So there's 5 classical reasoning courses. And you say, well, would I have to study all 5 of those to learn the art of reasoning? Yes, you would, because it's all of those parts taken together that make up the art and science of reasoning, okay? Aristotle is the principal author, and you'll see there's one other author here named Porphyry, okay? So let's talk about Porphyry real quick, and then we'll get back to Aristotle. Porphyry, you can see the dates of his life, 233 to 309, and make sure you notice it's AD. So we're talking about in the Christian era, right? After Christ. And AD doesn't stand for after death. Remember, it stands for Anno Domini, which means in the year of our Lord. So 233 to 309 years after the coming of Christ into the world, after the incarnation. So he lived 400 to what? 700, no, I'm sorry, let me do the math. 600 to 700 years after Aristotle, 200 to 300 years into the Christian era. He wrote a book that's called in Greek isagoge, which means introduction, okay? He wrote a book that's called The Introduction, and he wrote it because Aristotle's first book, The Categories, is very difficult to understand. And he, being a teacher, wanting to help others understand Aristotle's categories, he wrote a book that's called The Introduction. And we study that first in our Classical Reasoning 1 course. So we start with the introduction to Aristotle's categories that was written by Porphyry, and then we get into the works of Aristotle, okay? Now, you might want some proof. You might say, well, how do I know we're supposed to do it like that, right? Maybe, why are we studying Porphyry when Aristotle is really the master of the art of reasoning? Where'd you get this wacky idea? Well, this is how Aristotle has been studied through history, and I can prove it. If I take you back to the works of Aristotle, and this book here that I have open was published in 1654. 1654. It's a collection of all of the works of Aristotle, and it has the Greek text and it has a Latin translation together. But if you look at here we have a list of the works of Aristotle. And what I want you to see is right here listed first is actually not a work of Aristotle. It's actually Porphyry's Institutions, which again is just another translation of introduction. Porphyry's Introduction is included in the works of Aristotle, not because Aristotle wrote it, but because they were considered essential to the study of Aristotle after they were written around 300 AD. So Porphyry has always been included in the study of Aristotle's Organon. You see it here listed in the works of Aristotle. And then after that, you see listed the books of the Organon, which we're going to talk about next. So I just want you to see that this is not something that I invented or I stuck this extra book in there. It's not my own idea. It's how it's been studied in history. Porphyry's introduction, after it was written, was included in the study of classical reasoning. Okay. And this is a great book, by the way, because it's got the original Greek text and a Latin translation. If you're ever geeky enough to want to get into that, just let me know and I'll give you a link. So anyway, getting back to Aristotle. We see Porphyry's introduction up first, which was written about 300 AD. So let's say 600 to 700 years after Aristotle. And then we get into the real works of the Organon. We have the categories, and you'll wonder, what in the world do these things mean, right? What the categories, that's the first book. The second book, On Interpretation. Then we move to Classical Reasoning 2, and we study a book called Prior Analytics. Then in Classical Reasoning 3, we study a book titled Posterior Analytics. Then the Topics, and then a book called Sophistical Elenchi. It's a strange word, you don't know, but it can also be titled Sophistical Refutations. So those 6 books, the categories, On Interpretation, Prior Analytics, Posterior Analytics, Topics, and Sophistical Refutations, those are the 6 books that Aristotle wrote that teach us the complete art and science of reasoning. So if you want to learn the art of reasoning, you've got to study those specific 6 books. And that's what we do in classical reasoning. And that's what we're going to do in these meetings. We're just going to go through those books together. We're going to start with Porphyry, go through his introduction, which with a little bit of help from me, you'll find is actually very easy to understand. And then we'll get into the categories and go right on through the whole thing. Now, just to give you a quick summary of these before we wrap up here, the categories basically talks about different kinds of words. And I'm not going to say anything more. It's just think of it as a study of words, okay? The categories. The second book, On Interpretation, talks about sentences. So we start with words in the categories, learn some important things about names and ideas. Then in the second book, we talk about making sentences with those words and a special kind of sentence that's called enunciation, which is a statement that can be true or false. We learn about that on Interpretation. Then in Prior Analytics, we actually learn about the syllogism, which is an actual logical argument, how an argument is formed. We learn about that in Prior Analytics. We learn about the structure or the form of an argument. Then in Posterior Analytics, you can see analytics is named in both of these books. These are what are called the art and sciences of demonstrative reasoning. And I'll type it here for you real quick. This is what Plato and Socrates didn't understand. In the analytics, we studied demonstrative reasoning. That's the kind of reasoning that we need to establish sciences and understand the truth of different subjects. We have to have demonstrative reasoning. That's what Plato and Socrates did not have, demonstrative reasoning. That's what makes Aristotle the great philosopher, okay? Then in Classical Reasoning 4, we have the topics. In the topics, I see that question, Sarah, just give me 1 minute. In the topics, we study something else. We study what's called dialectical reasoning. That kind of reasoning, dialectical reasoning, that's what Socrates and Plato figured out. So Socrates and Plato understand dialectical reasoning, but Aristotle discovered the science of demonstrative reasoning. That's what makes Aristotle special. That's what makes him the greatest philosopher. He's the one who figured out the art and science of demonstrative reasoning, and it's that kind of reasoning that is used to solve the problems and answer the questions and establish sciences for all the different subjects, all right? And then the last book, which I think is probably the most fun, The last book, Sophistical, Elenchi, or Refutations, teaches us how to identify false arguments. Okay, you've probably heard the term fallacies before. Fallacies are false arguments that, they're deceiving because they appear to be true, so they can be deceitful. That last book in Classical Reasoning 5, we study Sophistical Elenchi or Sophistical Refutations, and we learn of the fallacies that Aristotle was able to explain and point out because he had discovered the real art and science of reasoning, and that allowed him to then see what exactly was wrong with false arguments that sophists or deceivers like to make. And he explains them in that last book. So that last book is sort of like the reward for studying the harder books. You get to get into the fallacies and imagine, in the future, knowing the art of reasoning, knowing the fallacies, and then going into life with that knowledge. Imagine how helpful and useful that would be, being able to discern these things, understand what's wrong with arguments people are making, and so on. So that's an overview for today of the art and science of reasoning. That's what I wanted to get through. Now, as for our studies, Sarah just asked, will we go through each and every lesson of each book? I plan on going through each and every lesson of each book. What we're not going to do, we're not going to rush through it. So I'm not going to guarantee that in our next class, we get through chapter 1 of Porphyry, and then in the next class, we do chapter 2. We may spend more time in certain lessons because they may just be longer, or they're more important, or they're more difficult. So we're just going to move through comfortably, reading through it together, talking through it, making sure everything is clear. And we're just going to slowly move through the whole thing. Okay, now you may say, oh, that stinks because I already started and I want to move faster. Well, what's going to happen is when we discuss things, even when we discuss beginning things, you're going to find that the things that cause you to struggle later on are actually simpler things that you didn't understand when you first read through earlier books. And so our live classes, even though we may not be talking yet about the lessons you're on, they'll explain things that make things clear and help you in those lessons. And eventually we'll catch up to where you're at. So it'll be helpful. Okay, but I plan to just move through the whole entire thing, lesson by lesson, class by class, and we'll move at a pace where we read through it, make sure we understand everything we read, and allow that to determine the pace we move at. Okay. All right. Yeah, that's good. Take this class to just keep everything together to review. That's very good. So yeah, think of it, for those of you who already started, it's sort of like a review with some more helpful information that'll make even more sense of your studies. Okay. And then, yeah, these will all be recorded. So, students who are getting started in the future, they can start with these recorded videos and then join us wherever we are in the class. Okay. So is that a clear overview of the study of reasoning? I hope that that's helpful. That's what I wanted to share. I'm going to stop the recording in just a minute here, but I wanted to introduce you to the subject as a whole to kind of give you an idea of where we're at in this study. I'm going to stop the recording right now here. Just a minute.